The first reading is from Isaiah chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the thresholds shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me! I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed, and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So in spite of the fact that we are finally turning the corner on COVID, there's been a lot of heaviness in the lives of a lot of people lately. For some, the heaviness has been the result of illness, death, or shocking accidents among family and friends, which actually were completely unrelated in most cases that I know of to COVID. For some, the heaviness is all the other problems that are going on in our society, making their way into our consciousness again, whether it's climate change, immigration debates, or mass shootings. And for some, the heaviness comes from needing to deal with the stress, the turmoil, and the change that these last 15 months have brought upon all of us. I suspect that many of us have a sense of heaviness from more than one of these things. And usually, when something is heavy in our lives, it is not a good thing. A heavy thing is usually something which weighs on our minds even when we're not actively thinking. It kind of percolates in the back of our brains, and it's just sort of a constant presence. When something is heavy, it's usually something which feels like it's crushing our souls and putting a damper on our ability to experience any good things that are also happening around us. And when something is heavy, when we think of something being heavy, it's a thing that can often cause us to have a sense of resignation or even despair, because so many of the heavy things we deal with are, by definition, things we can't change or do very much about. I suspect that Isaiah also felt a sense of heaviness in his life as he entered the temple in today's first reading. Life around him was not all that good. There were enemy armies who had conquered the northern kingdom, and they were now threatening Judah and Jerusalem, where Isaiah lived. Isaiah, like many of the prophets, was also disturbed that this external threat had not resulted in the people of Jerusalem banding together and saying, okay, we're all in this together, being good citizens who needed each other, or even being people who called upon God to help them out. And it's clear that even Isaiah, who was one of the good people in Jerusalem, knew that he himself had messed up as well. He could see that he also was in some sense part of the problem. Life was probably full of heaviness for Isaiah. And then he entered the temple, and to his shock and even horror, he encountered an even heavier thing: the actual presence and glory of God. He looks up and he sees a vision of God sitting on his throne, surrounded by seraphs, which are these winged types of angels, who cry out that indeed the whole earth is full of God's heaviness. And that's because the root word in Hebrew for glory is the word for heavy or weighty. God's glory is not simply a pretty decoration, but the weightiest thing of all. And the presence of God, which reveals his glory, is heavier than anything else. And so Isaiah says, "Woe is me, I'm toast. The heaviness of God's glory is going to crush me, finish me off." That's what people thought would happen if they ever actually caught a glimpse of God. The weight of God's glory would just dissolve them. The best contemporary expression of that theology is in the Indiana Jones movie, where they're looking for the lost ark and they find the lost ark. These who have gotten it decide they're going to take the top off and look inside, and they look inside and they start to see the glory of God, and all of a sudden they scream and they dissolve. That's the theology of the Old Testament, that if you even caught a glimpse of even the little bit of God, that would happen to you. So Isaiah goes, this is bad. This is bad for me. But the heaviness of God doesn't crush Isaiah. Instead, he finds that the heaviness of God's presence outweighs all the other heaviness in his life. God's heaviness is weightier than his personal sin. It's weightier than the problems of his society. It's even weightier than the external threats that surround them. And so Isaiah finds that the weight, the heaviness of God's presence actually helps him to deal with all the other heaviness in his life. God's heaviness gives him the ability to acknowledge the weight of the problems that might have always been there, but that he had probably been trying not to think about. You know, he comes in there and finally the first things he says out of his mouth are not, "Wow, cool, whoa." It's like, "Woe is me." Because in that moment, all the stuff that maybe was percolating in the back of his mind, like the problems and the heaviness we try not to think about, suddenly came to the foreground, and it was obvious that there was a problem. But sometimes acknowledging the problem and recognizing the problem is the first part of dealing with the heaviness. God's heaviness gives him the ability to have hope and trust that God's heaviness was going to help him and not crush him. This is one of the amazing things. Actually, it's always an amazing thing. You don't actually need me to exegete this for you, but the coals that were on the altar, I mean, you get the sense that the vision of God and the angels is something only he can see, but the coals are a real thing. There's an altar and there's coals for burning incense and sacrifice, and the seraph takes one of the live coals and says, "Here, let me touch your lips." And I'm going, "No, maybe not me." But Isaiah lets it happen because Isaiah trusts that somehow or other this heaviness of God's glory is not going to kill him. It's actually going to help him. And God's heaviness gives Isaiah the ability to be willing to act, even in the face of the heaviness of his life. Isaiah says, "Here am I. Send me when you need somebody to go and talk and speak." Now, for full disclosure, every time we read this passage of Isaiah in our lectionary, I don't think there has ever been a time where this is not where the passage ends. "Here am I, send me." But if you go home and you read the rest of the verses, the ones 4 or 5 verses after this, God basically says to Isaiah, "Good, you're going to go and you're going to tell people this, but have no delusions. They're not going to listen to you, and it's not going to do any good. But go do it anyway." Isaiah, for him, the heaviness of God simply came from having a living experience of the presence of God in his life. About God. He could describe the seraphs, because he had all these things about what they were doing with their wings, but all he described about God was the hem of his robe. That's all really that he saw. And even with instructions from God on what to do next, Isaiah was still unclear on exactly what God was up to. I mean, why send me to talk and speak if it doesn't seem like it's going to do any good? He's not sure. But none of those things mattered because Isaiah experienced the heaviness of God as different from the heaviness of life. God's heaviness gave him strength. God's heaviness gave him hope. God's heaviness gave him the courage to act even when he knew his own actions might not seem to make that much of a difference, at least not right now. And on this Holy Trinity Sunday, when sometimes we try way too hard to figure God out, Isaiah is a helpful reminder that the real message of the doctrine of the Trinity is that God's glory, God's heaviness, God's very being is greater than anything we can really describe or imagine. And it's also the message that God's glory, God's heaviness, is found through having an actual living experience of the presence of God in our lives, which God intends us to experience as a counterweight to all the other heaviness that we so often have to deal with. As with Isaiah, the heaviness of God's presence in our lives is intended to give us strength. It doesn't stop, unfortunately, all the heaviness of our problems, but it gives us the experience of those problems. And it also allows us to honestly face the heaviness, to begin to deal with it, and sometimes, too, the ways in which, at least I find for myself, the ways that I sometimes cause the heaviness in my own life. If for nothing else, because I try to avoid the heaviness or I wallow in it too much. Sometimes the weightiness, the heaviness of God can be the thing that allows me to actually acknowledge it, look at it squarely, and begin to deal with it. And that actually helps and gives me strength. As with Isaiah, the heaviness of God's presence in our lives. Not that we can solve all of the heaviness of life if we would just get our act together better, but that the heaviness of life is not all that there is, even when we to feel that way. And it's the message that the heaviness of life will not win out in the end. I mean, we remember the words of Isaiah, not because Isaiah's words necessarily changed what the people were doing in that moment. We remember them because God's promise that in the end the heaviness wasn't going to completely crush and destroy Israel actually turned out to be true. In the end, God's heaviness. And that's the message we're supposed to. And God's heaviness, like with Isaiah, is intended to give us courage to act. Even if it's not clear that what we're doing is going to make a lot of difference, solve the heaviness that we're dealing with. Isaiah figured that it was important to speak because God asked him to do it. And sometimes God asks us to act simply to resist the heaviness that's all around us. And that simple act of resistance is itself a witness to the presence of God in our lives. I remember I've always been one of these World War II junkies. So one of the things that I learned about a long time ago was the Colditz Castle in Germany during the Second World War. It was the place where they put all of the Allied escape artists, all the people that they could not keep confined in all the other prisoner of war camps. I'm pretty sure, as the story goes along, that nobody actually successfully escaped from Colditz until they were liberated by the British at the end of the war. But they kept trying. And they were interviewing some of these people that had survived the war in this castle, and they said, you knew that you couldn't. And they said, because it was our job to resist. We knew that a new day was coming. We knew we were going to win. We knew it was worth our act of resistance to show that there was another day coming. That was our job, and so we did it. And sometimes that's what God asks us to do too, to be people who resist the heaviness in our lives. People who are willing to say there's something more, and we're going to show it simply by our resistance to the heaviness. Sometimes our lives also feel full of heaviness because of stress and problems and external threats. But as the seraphs reminded Isaiah, and as they remind us, the whole earth is also full of God's heaviness, which is actually weightier than everything else. And so God called Isaiah, and God calls us to continually open ourselves to experiencing God's presence, so that the heaviness of life won't be all that we feel. God called Isaiah, God calls us, to live in ways that help us experience God's presence in spite of the heaviness that so often distracts us. And God called Isaiah, God calls us to act with hope and courage because we're promised that in the end, the heaviness of God's presence, love, and mercy will win out over all the other heaviness in our lives.